Excellent. We're going to get started, everyone. So welcome to the Buildings Pavilion this afternoon. My name is Matt Black, and I'm going to be moderating our session today titled One Size Fits No One, Rethinking the Just Transition from Forests to Cities, Local, Equitable, and Nature-Based Solutions for the Climate Crisis, potentially one of the longest session titles I've seen so far at COP this week. We've got a fantastic session for you today. I've been a bit of a last-minute substitution, so please forgive me if I stumble over a few bits. I haven't had too much time to practice, but we've got some wonderful participants ready to discuss how tackling the climate crisis in relation to our built environment is not just about emissions reductions and decarbonisation. We know that cities occupy only 2% of the Earth's terrestrial surface, but consume over 75% of natural resources, according to UNEP, and that the built environment is one of 4 value chains alongside food, energy, and fashion, responsible for approximately 90% of nature and biodiversity loss worldwide, according to WBCSD. So buildings, infrastructure, and the built environment more generally as a whole can bring multiple co-benefits that must be realized alongside emissions reductions. And this includes improved health and well-being, social equity, improved outcomes for nature and biodiversity, and improving the overall resilience of our world. People are the very foundation of our cities and communities. The purpose of our homes, buildings, and places is to provide shelter and space for people throughout their lives. And as a result, the built environment plays a pivotal role in shaping and influencing social dynamics. So in light of all of this, I'm going to kick off the session by giving a short presentation on World GBC's recently released Social Impacts Across the Built Environment report. So this week marks the announcement of the Buildings Breakthrough. I hope you're all aware of that. It's a pledge signed by 28 countries so far, with the late addition of Ghana, and they account for 1/5 of total global greenhouse gas emissions, and they've come together with a view to make near zero emissions and climate resilient buildings the new normal by 2030. We're now struck with the urgent need for a roadmap of actions to guide these countries in implementing this breakthrough. And it's tempting to think that there's a one-size-fits-all solution for the built environment that will simultaneously cover drastic emissions reductions, the regeneration of nature, and a just and equitable transition for all. But sadly, no such silver bullet exists. So it's our role at World GBC and all of our partners here at the Global Buildings Pavilion as a global network and thought leaders in this space to guide the industry on how to tackle the climate crisis in nuanced, localized ways needed to protect and enhance the lives of people and communities. So a really quick overview of World GBC for those of you who aren't familiar. The World Green Building Council is the largest and most influential local, regional, global action network leading the transformation to a sustainable and decarbonized built environment for everyone, everywhere. We work with businesses, organizations, and governments around the world to deliver the ambitions of the Paris Agreement and the UN SDGs. And we do this alongside over 75 green building councils and their 46,000 members from all over the world. Many of you may have heard World GBC's work around climate action and circular economy over the last week, supporting the race to zero, supporting the buildings breakthrough. You may have even heard of our net zero carbon buildings commitment, but in this presentation we're focusing on the social side of things in relation to the just energy transition and how we can transform the sector, leaving no one behind. So, what is the problem? The problem is that the built environment marks the physical location that all climate and social stresses are felt, whether that's within our homes, communities, and cities. We sometimes forget that our work on climate action is fundamentally for people, you and me in this room and everyone watching on the live stream. and that the built environment industry can sometimes be disengaged from the social element of sustainable development and see only the environmental and social issues faced by the sector as different or separate. This is reflected by research and industry insights that organizations find the E rather easier than the S in ESG in terms of corporate sustainability reporting and target setting. So, in accordance with the narrative of this event, World GBC recognizes that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and the risk from that, if we were to implement, would that there be a tendency to overlook a lot of people when it comes to the built environment. So in order to address this problem, we believe that we need to unite and align the ways in which we tackle people and planet, community and emissions. These issues are inexorably linked, and a lack of action on one side of this coin will definitely curtail the other. World GBC has been developing a publication for the past 6 months to encourage the sector to engage with social impacts in the same way, using the same language as we do with emissions. For us to truly embark on a just transition, we must be looking at action for people and climate holistically and ensuring that the impacts of both can be considered in an aligned way. Which will, we believe, make it substantially easier for the industry to tackle both the E and the S together. So it's my pleasure to introduce the social impact across the built environment report. This was officially released earlier in the week on Monday the 4th here at COP28. And we're proud that it's supported by the high-level climate champions. And you can see on screen, hopefully you've been reading a quote from this year's high-level climate champion. So, what is the report? What's the core part? Because I realize I have only a few minutes left. So, apologies. The core part of this paper is World GBC making a relatively provocative statement to the industry and presenting a framework based on the terminology of scopes that, when it comes to emissions reduction and decarbonization, that we should all be relatively familiar with in relation to the greenhouse gas protocol. In the same way that global markets recognize and measure scopes 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions, World GBC's global network is calling for the sector to adopt an aligned framing on social impact, which is also based on 3 scopes, plus a new scope 0. So by arranging these considerations for the first time into scopes, the sector can define the diversity of social impact across the built environment as part of their first steps on this journey. Now, I'm just going to go along here so I can actually see the slide, but hopefully you can sort of see what we're getting at here in terms of relating the social issues and the way to describe them as we do with emissions reductions. Scope 0, you can see there, is all around entity and internal practices for an organization. And the lighting really isn't doing great, but you can see the bullet points there covering ethical leadership, employee health, working conditions, satisfaction, stakeholder engagement, and corporate governance. And these are things that many businesses are tackling and focusing on, but hopefully by putting them into this format, we can create some way of measuring and aligning on this and making sure that we're all talking about the same thing at the same time. Quickly moving through, in terms of scope 1, we've got the actual users of our buildings and the site, and examples of this is obviously housing in terms of its attainability and habitability, that doesn't feel like a word, but it definitely is, indoor environmental air quality, and climate change impacts and adaptation measures. Scope 2 is in relation to the community and the surroundings of our assets in the built environment, and here's where we want to consider factors around accessibility, the just transition to ensure that everyone is able to use and access our buildings equally, and also ensure community protection and empowerment. And finally, in terms of scope 3, so this is either downstream or upstream, that the environmental risks related to buildings, including their sustainable construction, the transparency in auditing, and labour rights, crucially, of those involved in construction are also considered. Sorry. So that's a bit of a really brief run through, and we only have a few minutes today, so apologies I can't go into more detail. But I really encourage you to take a look at the report. It obviously goes into more detail about this framework and how it can be used by entities to really start that piece on alignment. And so my penultimate slide really is this graphic, highlighting that this paper aims to invigorate the industry's engagement with both the social and environmental elements of sustainability in the built environment, really to revolutionize decisions being made at the investment, design, construction, operational, and end-of-life phases. It also has the potential to dramatically restructure environmental, social, and corporate governance, so that's the ESG reporting, bringing a structure and alignment between the E and the S that we've talked about. So how should organizations use these scopes? How do we ensure this thinking becomes best practice and ultimately business as usual in our decision makings? Once again, apologies, I'm just going to lean around so I can see this. We've got 5 A's on screen that help organizations understand this content and implement it in their entities. So we have awareness, assessment, accountability, action, and advocacy. So, we hope to be able to say that this time next year, organizations such as yourselves in the room, if you're responsible for an entity, will be talking about their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, but also their scope 0 to 3 social impacts, i.e., I've calculated both the scope 3 impacts from an emissions and social impact perspective. GBC and our Green Building Council network will be continuing to promote this report throughout the new year with further events and communications, but people can access the paper through the QR code or the URL on screen. And obviously, if you have any questions, please do get in touch afterwards. So, that's me done for the opening presentation. I'm now going to pass over to our first speaker this afternoon, and that is Marta Ribeira Cabero from the Institute of Human Rights and Business. Marta, would you like to come up?
Thank you so much, Matt, for the introduction and also for introducing the need to address decarbonization in the built environment and advancing in a just transition. This saves me from intruding remarks that would take me some time. But yeah, just let me see. Is that the slides are working? Yes, okay. So thank you very much for being present, and thank you also for the invitation. You will be all probably familiar with the concept of a just transition, so I will not need to go deeper into definitions or the lack of agreed definitions. But from the Institute of Human Rights and Business, what we want to emphasize is that decarbonization actions in the built environment without a just transition approach have the risk of exacerbating existing inequalities, but also have the opportunity to tackle them and diminish them. And I will first start this presentation by explaining a little bit the project that we have been implementing for the last months, which is Building for Today and for the Future, Advancing for the Just Transition in the Built Environment. And this project has 3 different goals, the first of which is to strengthen the evidence base for a just transition in the built environment in 3 different cities. The second one was to create a collective narrative and visioning sessions, and so we titled the second goal "Moving Hearts and Minds." And the third one was to change policy. So we issued several policy briefs on the topic, but I will mainly be focusing on the first and in the second goals of the project. So we chose, on the first one, on the strengthening the evidence base, we chose 8 different cities in which we investigated the climate transition processes relating to the built environment that were already happening in these 8 cities globally. And we have already published 5 of these reports, which are available on the website, and you will have the QR codes available later. But on the processes again, this process that may include the decarbonization. Some examples of these processes that we analyzed were the decarbonization of existing or new buildings, circular construction practices to reduce the impacts of materials, or switching to renewable energy sources. So one of the questions that we were deeply analyzing were how these processes were impacting the people in the built environment, both positively and negatively. And we also analyzed who was involved in the decision making, and also what could be done differently. And on the methodology, there were, so we chose local teams in each of the 8 cities, and they performed research analysis during 3 months that would involve stakeholder mapping and also semi-structured interviews with different actors, such as policymakers, the private actors, businesses, academia, NGOs. I am saying this to emphasize the wide range of actors that were addressed in drafting these in-depth researches. And so and this is the first part, the researches. And during the time that these researches were implemented and were done, we looked for, we did the visioning sessions that were under the second goal. And the goal of these visioning sessions was to contribute to a strengthened collective narrative in each city for the green and equitable transformation in the built environment. So what does that mean? We mean that we brought together very different actors, such as tenants, construction workers, industry investors, and policymakers to co-create visions and pathways for a just transition in the built environment. So we created together a vision of what a just transition looks like in each of the cities. Those are the cities that are under the project, and we have published researches for all of them, but for Jakarta, Valparaiso, and Athens, which are still undergoing. And now it comes to the time to talk about the art, the roaming art exhibition that you may have seen both outside, and you can see here in the room. Okay, yeah, here. So what was the objective of the visioning sessions? Was to create this collective narrative, but how do we actually explain the conclusions that we reached during those visioning sessions? So we thought about art as an excellent way to communicate the results from the visioning sessions. We recognize art as a united language for change, and therefore we commissioned not only artists, but young artists from each city to develop art pieces that would bring this visioning sessions results to life. So we hope that these pieces could unite groups with diverse life experiences, with inspiring inclusion and inclusive visions of the transition. Here you can access the different researches that we have already published on what a just transition looks like in the built environment. And as I've said, and as the title of this session states, one size fits no one. So these researches, what they exemplify is that the need to address very specific local actors and to adapt the policies of the just decarbonization in the built environment to each very local environment. So what did we find out in these researches? What does an unjust transition look like in the different cities? So we found very specific and clear examples. For instance, in Prague, in the Czech Republic or Czechia, we saw how the program called the New Green Savings Program provided incentives for building retrofits. But however, when performing those retrofits, the landlord transferred the costs of the retrofits onto the occupants, which could not afford the new prices, and this created renovictions, so evictions by renovations, and also increased socio-spatial inequalities, which is a great example on the risk of not addressing the decarbonization in the built environment with a just transition perspective. And another great example that we had is in Lagos, in Nigeria, where the new Eco-Atlantic Council aimed to provide energy-efficient homes and also to prevent the effect that rising sea levels would have. But we saw that this program was only addressed to luxury apartments, which local communities could not afford. And also a very great example was a policy implemented at the national level, but we analyzed when we were doing the Lisbon report, was the golden visa that Portugal was applying for those investing over 350,000 euros on renovations. But the scheme, what it eventually did, although it had some decarbonization actions like, reducing the emissions from the existing building stock, it exacerbated inequality because it made housing less accessible in the city of Lisbon, which has already an ongoing housing crisis. And this is the negative side, but you will be wondering, what does a just transition in the built environment look like? And we also had some great examples from different cities, and one of them is, for instance, in Copenhagen in Denmark, and is an example coming from the private sector, from a real estate investor called Home.Earth, which is building net zero homes in the city of Copenhagen, but it also incorporating this just transition approach, as it's committing in the long term to the ownership of the housing stock. It's returning 50% of the gains to the tenants, so that the housing is accessible price-wise, and it also supports the tenants with a non-evictions policy. So this is the first example that we've had, and the second one that I will be talking about is the one we found in Melbourne in Australia, coming from the public sector, which leveraged the opportunity of an updated environmental design standards and updated its public procurement practices for social housing, and this benefited both Aboriginal communities, women, etc., etc. So if you are interested in the different impacts that we saw on the different cities, I would advise you to consult the materials in our webpage. But lastly, and maybe of course the most different part of this presentation, is how these young artists took the results from the visioning sessions and showed them in these wonderful art pieces. So for instance, we can see some of the results from what an unjust transition looks like in Prague. You have also the art piece there. We can see how the artists try to express how are the renovations affecting the city, and how is green gentrification affecting the city of Prague and housing affordability. And also the one you have there on the Lisbon case, we could see how the artists try to express how this impact on green investment had on housing affordability, but also how leading with the social perspective on the decarbonization practices in the built environment can avoid this from happening. So I welcome you not only to look at the pieces that we have here in the room, but also to look at the 3 remaining that we have outside of the pavilion. And thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thanks, Marta. I think that was really interesting, and I hope it worked well for you all to see some social value stuff in action there from those projects, linking back to World GBC's reports. Maybe we can have a look at them and try to attribute some scopes to them. My tablet isn't working fantastically. which isn't great. So I'm just trying to figure out who's coming up next. And that is Per Olof Su, President of the Building and Woodworkers International. Per, thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very important event. Of course, our perspective on this issue coming from a trade union organization is to focus on the effects of the workers. And it's one significant aspect to consider when you talk about decarbonization of the built environment is actually the effect it has on workers, on their rights, on their jobs, on their safety, and on their future. And that is not only because they are the ones who have to deliver decarbonization. They build the houses where we live. They build the infrastructure. They produce the materials that are needed to do it. And it's also because they are a part of the communities where we all live and are affected by tremendous pre-existing hardships. In our cities, they often live in houses and neighborhoods without much access to environmental goods, green spaces, for instance, and in environments that are harmful for their health. They work outdoor and suffer firsthand the impact of heat or other weather events. They are displaced by millions from rural areas when a climate disaster hits, and often they find job in forestry, brickmaking, construction, sectors that already are affected by high rates of informality, low wages, and high safety risks. And I think about the workers in this region. Coming here this morning from my hotel, I crossed incredible buildings, which I'm sure are having high climatic standards for residents. But where do the workers who built them live? Can they afford to live in these greenhouses and apartments with high environmental standards? And under what conditions do they work? And that is a fact. It's not a question only here. It's a question to be asked anywhere in the world. My first point, therefore, is we have to integrate equity and social justice and human rights considerations like the fundamental rights at work and the right to health in any discussion and practice regarding decarbonization, even in the built environment. Or else it will just risk to exacerbating inequalities at the workplace and in access to climate-resilient infrastructure and housing for all. And these are, in fact, the principle behind the BWI Climate Manifesto that we ask all important panelists here and organizations in the room to pledge for. I'm convinced that we can deliver the decarbonization that our sector needs, and at the same time also make sure that we can enhance protection for workers if we join forces to negotiate a transition that is just. And going back to this overall question, my second point is that there is a myriad of different social impacts. Some are positive and some are negative. There is no one size fits all, as the title of this panel says. From a global perspective, however, I can say that the key driver for positive social impacts is the participation of the affected communities of workers and their trade unions at all stages of the decarbonization process, from the planning to the delivery. And the transition by itself is a change in the way we produce materials, in the way we build our houses and infrastructures, in the way we manage our forests. Change is never neutral. It means that life can be better or it can get worse. And who better than those affected by such changes can say if and how they can be positive for them and their families? There are some incredible examples within the BWI family of trade unions that have joined forces with local community organizations, with local governments, with employers and businesses to ensure that low-carbon solutions and a mindful use of resources have a broader positive societal impact. For example, forestry workers and their trade unions can play a pivotal role in promoting community empowerment and sustainable forestry practices. Especially in rural hinterlands, local communities often depend on forestry-related activities. And sustainable value chains that connect cities with rural areas, including, for example, by integrating indigenous knowledge into sustainable forestry and wood processing practices, can ensure that the benefits of sustainable forestry are distributed fairly and that nature-based solutions are both environmentally and socially sustainable. If we want to ensure that vulnerable communities and ecosystems are at the heart and benefit from the decarbonization, we need actions grounded in what the workers and the communities need and say. So that's pretty much what I wanted to add here. Thank you very much for being able to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Per-Olof. Again, drawing attention to a key consideration there in terms of the workers involved in the construction and maintenance of our built environment. Up next, we have Philip Misselwitz of Bauhaus Earth, and Anna, are you going to go first? Philip says so, so I think that's the way it's going. Okay, up first we have Anna Dyson of Yale University.
Okay, hopefully this will go to my slide. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to just touch briefly on the relationship in the ESG that has been eloquently described thus far between decarbonization and social ethics. This is, I'm sorry I don't have a QR code here, but this is our recent report, Building Materials and the Climate, Constructing the Future. And one of the things that we touch on sort of importantly is that there can be no decarbonization without ethical decarbonization. That is, we can't have fair certification of decarbonized building products or so-called environmental products without the social justice part. And so oftentimes they've been decoupled. I'm not going to touch on these figures, but you can go to our report to see the impact that building materials will be having in the next several years. It's projected to be up to 50% of the built environment sector as a whole, which is already over 37% of global process carbon emissions. So what is ethical decarbonization? Ultimately, if we're going to be counting the environmental and ecosystemic impacts of our building materials, clearly living human beings are part of the living ecosystem. So we have to put the human beings back center into the ecosystem and in turn understand that so-called ecosystem services, if we can still call them that, it's a very anthropocentric term, but we tend to talk about the value of our built environment as ecosystem services, that ultimately the labor piece has to be counted as part of the ecosystem as living systems. And so overall, our report is talking about a shift towards circularity and bio-based circularity wherever possible. But we're also looking at dramatically improving conventional processes. And so there's synergy between all of these different factors. Now, ultimately, in a process, in an ethical decarbonization process that values front and center human dignity and health and well-being, that then needs to be coupled very tightly with biodiversity and the biodiversity of living systems. Ultimately, our health and immunity is intimately tied to even the presence of rare flowering plants, for example, in our environment. So we are basically looking at embodied energy of buildings of up between 65 and 85% before we even start construction. And the reason for that is because of the way that we even treat our site, our soils, and the way that we treat the environment. And I'll show that as an example in Botswana in a few minutes. But ultimately, we're looking at dramatically increase in the accountability of data streams and the twinning of fair certification of products, green certification, which includes both labor and carbon, and impacts on the health of regional ecosystems. The other critical piece to this is to really work hard on making sure that there's participation across the board from informal to semi-formal and formal sectors. What that means is if we're ultimately shifting towards bio-based and regenerative practices, then we're looking at new models for cooperation between forestry, agriculture, and the building sectors. Those three sectors are at risk for forced and unfair labor practices in many different ways. So instead of having a compounded problem where we compound the labor issues across the three different sectors, we're looking at fair certification processes that allows for third-party accountability and accounting that would mitigate the unfair practices across the three different sectors. So just to touch briefly on this, our report has a sort of tripartite structure where we're looking at avoiding excessive carbon emissions and deleterious impacts on the built environment by trying to avoid the extraction of raw, non-renewable minerals wherever possible. And so it's not just about carbon, it's also about the depletion of natural resources, and as I said, the fair treatment of ecosystems and allowing them to flourish, which does not happen with current mineral-based processes. And then shifting wherever possible to regenerative bio-based practices. So for example, we use a lot of steel, aluminum, concrete, et cetera, for buildings and built environments that don't necessarily require those materials. So where it's possible to substitute sustainable regenerative practices, we would like to do that. And lastly, to radically improve through decarbonizing conventional material processes. There are many opportunities to decarbonize, for example, cement and concrete industry that are extremely important that we outline in our report, but while insisting once again that it's not just about decarbonization, but it's also about reducing the impact on. So in a future in circular built environment, buildings become banks or material banks if we're designing for disassembly and reassembly and reuse. We are looking at, as I said, new models of cooperation across the sectors, and ultimately new economic models that are required that enhance cooperation and split incentives across the life cycle of stakeholders. Now, that last part is extremely important because if we're to shift towards true life cycle thinking, we need to simultaneously incentivize across the life cycle with new ownership models and new skin in the game to be able to support the design for circularity and then the maintenance of buildings for circularity. And we say end of use, not end of life for the circularity. So this is opening up a whole host of new types of really job sectors because there's going to be more participation and increased participation that will be required by, for example, professionals in geological engineering and ecosystems management, et cetera, that were previously not part of or connected, let's say, to waste management services. So all these new connections and new networks are extremely promising for new types of job creation. Now, the role of regulation is extremely important. It's complex and very different across regions, but ultimately what we are pushing for is the twinning of both fair labor certification with environmental regulation that can lead eventually to global embodied energy codes that are enforceable, and of course public procurement and large employers are very important in this regard, and to use tools and digitization to be able to track and keep track of building materials and components throughout the very complex supply chain. And I'm just going to, and then of course the visualization is, as you can see, new visualization methods will include impact on the work of the geobiosphere, impact on labor, and be able to fairly monitor job sites in ways that really cut down on labor violations and labor practices. And the accessibility of those tools. I'm just running out of time a little bit, and I want to touch on this one Global South example. This is one example from our report, but we have many other case studies that are coming out across India, West Africa, Guatemala, Peru, and Canada, and Finland are the case study sites for the first round, but we're very open in phase 2 to more case study sites. In this particular case, this is an example in Botswana where there was a cooperation and upskilling of labor practices from informal to semi-formal to formal in both the concrete sector, where in this case, you're looking at on-site factory-based processes that are designing for disassembly and reassembly and modularization and the dramatic reduction of concrete materials, and also addition wherever possible of secondary and supplemental binders from waste streams. You're also looking at the inclusion of finishes and other things and other post-agricultural waste and post-forest detritus waste finishes. But most importantly, I just want to start from really the get-go of a site. As we said, if we are going to, in future life cycle accounting, include the work of the geobiosphere and regional ecosystems in the accounting, we have to start. This was a virgin site in Botswana, and it's been designed such that in addition to that modular concrete and all of the modular sort of biomaterials that you saw on the previous slide, the site itself was designed such that the flora and the fauna could continue below the site and above the site. As I mentioned, 65 to 85% of the embodied energy in a building is before construction even starts, but we also rarely count the impact of soil health and of flora and fauna in a site. So in this particular case, for example, you can see with these open oculi, they're constructed in and around the old growth trees in the savanna, and the passage of flora and fauna is carried up above on top of, this is all bioretention swales and water retention on the top, and then finally the inclusion of next generation solar technology that reduces to 1% semiconductor material in comparison to conventional solar. So why am I bringing that up? Because, for example, the semiconductor industry and the solar industry is rife with labor violations and forced and unfair labor practices. And being able to transition from intensive non-renewable mineral processes to systems like this, for example, that are largely glass and potentially bioplastics, allows for the transition towards materials that are both circular but also far less at risk for labor violations and toxic production practices. I'm going to pass it over there because I think Philippe has a lot of material to show on in the area of bio-based materials.
So how do I get to my slides? Will you? Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting panel where we switch always between the sort of meta-level arguments that we need to have and paradigm shifts that we need to think about towards case studies. And this is also how we agreed, actually, we would split our slot. I will take you into the world of Bhutan for the next 7-8 minutes as a kind of case study, emphasizing also how we need to think about these shifts as kind of place-based strategies. There will be very different kind of material availabilities, very different social, cultural contexts to consider. So the world of Bhutan is, I think, maybe a low-hanging fruit. It's a small country. It has gone through moderate urbanization, but it is also a country that has repeatedly shown the way, presenting alternative models to the global debate, like the Gross Happiness Index that some of you might know. I'll take you to rural Bhutan, and this is where you actually see what you see sort of when you drive through these mountainous roads. And for me, this is not to be romanticized, but it is certainly to be valued and appreciated, the sort of ongoing embedded knowledge around bio-based circular construction that's going on. You see here rammed earth being constructed through a sort of social network of neighbors that help each other in the season. There's a short season where buildings can be done, and they get together, do rammed earth construction, take bits of wood just as needed from the nearby forests, have local temporary production workshops set up. So this is sort of almost 100% regenerative and recyclable and circular. Now, this kind of embedded knowledge exists also in the crafts and in occasional sort of prestigious projects, sometimes funded from abroad, from Bhutan enthusiasts. But when it comes to cities, and there are not many cities, and they haven't gone through tremendous and dramatic urbanization yet, but you see this knowledge, you see the disconnect, and this kind of knowledge gets completely lost. And it is actually mostly imported labor and also materials, steel and construction, steel and concrete, that produces this sort of fast-growing urbanization where bio-based is suddenly just a supportive material for shattering and no longer a core part of the story. So these are the sort of challenges that now the government of Bhutan and various organizations are dealing with, how to prevent at fairly early stage, how to organize a shift, a sector shift thought through systemically to prevent the already appearing sort of negative drivers of urbanization that we can absorb everywhere else in the world to much more greater degree, and return to a sort of regenerative building program that will radically shift the sector back, in a sense, I should say, back to bio-based, locally available, regional, organized kind of value chains, and also think about actually the entire challenge as from the perspective of labor, and this is how we frame it: 40,000 dirty, dull, and dangerous jobs by largely imported labor and management into 1,000 healthy, dignified, exciting jobs across rural and urban areas in Bhutan. So Bhutan, again, is known for its incredibly advanced and impressive nature preservation. There is more than 6% forest cover. Most of it is under preservation, strict preservation, and these are the forest management units where logging is possible. And so in this project, which involves a number of actors, Arabs, prior associates, and Gregoransky architects, and us, Bauhaus Earth, to assess the sort of material demand in Thimphu, the capital city, the likely material demand over the next few years as the city slowly urbanizes towards sort of about 200,000 people. And we are actually helping to think sort of systemically, in a sense, across the building cycle, how locally available timber in Bhutan, harvested only in these restricted forest management units, could feed this demand and achieve almost complete sort of bio-base in the building sector. So, and these are quickly, because I think it speaks to the sort of social and environmental safeguards that we are all discussing for this transition, from source to finish, obviously. And I would like to sort of really emphasize that we should not think about only as a social project, but really as a sort of intertwined social and environmental project. And of course, in Bhutan, this resonates particularly with the sort of local Buddhist way of life. But from ecological silvicultural practice towards, it's very crucial, the sort of low impact harvesting, but also forest worker health and safety, which at the moment is not given and not reinforced, towards the various kind of safeguards that need to be established along the value chain into product material development, material testing, quality assurance, etc., etc. and crucially also towards industrial reskilling and publication and outreach. And I'm going through this quickly because we don't have time, but this is an example of a project, a pilot project, built around actually the design of a value chain for mass timber that Gray-Organsky architects and others are developing at the moment, where structural timber can be supplied, or it's shown, this pilot project shows how structural timber can be supplied to answer urban needs, a little bit in Bhutanese architectural style for a sort of mixed-use kind of urban form Thimphu. And of course, this is very much the challenges were already addressed. How do we keep these kind of building materials, even structural elements, somehow in circulation? Anna was making the point, which I think is crucial, not to talk about end of life, but end of use, and also thinking about the not just timber, but also a very broad material palette that again feeds from traditional building practices, from rice husk to hemp to sawdust. Collateral materials from the sawmills to mud, clay, also earth-based, geo-based materials, and the various sort of needs that urbanization has. And we are actually now setting up a sort of showroom, sort of discursive space in the center of Thimphu in an old market, where all these kind of materials are being sort of tested, prototyped, but also then discussed with school kids, with youth groups, and it has already been sanctified. This is obviously an important step which involves mainly men, as you can see, but then the idea really is to make it a very broad discourse in Bhutan. So what's going on here? I'm going through this quickly. So this is, in a sense, the elements of this regenerative Bhutan project, which the government is launching and which we are advising, which has really a broad range. And many of these factors really speak to our particular discussion here on just transitions. And I quickly want to summarize my point, that the opportunity here is to think about this transition as place-based, climate, nature, and human. I should also add positive construction value chains to repair our cities and biosphere. And I think there is a tremendous opportunity here also in thinking about this building industry, this bio-based building industry, to be redistributing actually value gains and economic opportunities and access across urban rural areas. And I think what it really needs is obviously very, very strong guardrails, protecting nature, but also social guardrails that were mentioned brilliantly by my previous speakers, and also a valuing and mobilizing of different sets of knowledges. In Bhutan, it's very, very clear also indigenous embedded practices of constructing, and then I just can't read this at this angle. And yeah, I think we need obviously investment in this. And for Bhutan, this is actually very simple. You can actually help an entire country to radically shift the building sector through a fairly moderate investment of about 50 million euros for a mass timber plant as an essential core element of a new value chain. It's very, very moderate. And I hope that Bhutan made an amazing investment in setting up a pavilion for the first time and hoping to attract such an investment. But finally, I think this is very, very important to actually really give access to the opportunities in this kind of sectors by reskilling programs and speaking to young generations and really making sure that these jobs arrive at the people who really deserve them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna and Philippe. I think it was fantastic there to see some real-world examples of projects where some of the topics and considerations that we've been discussing today are being considered and put into practice. Our final two speakers, please welcome up Ryan Kolker from the International Code Council, who will be followed by Juan Caballero from BuildChange very briefly.
invite Juan up. I think we're going to have a little bit of a sort of conversation on how to really activate, many of the things that the presenters have provided before. We actually have one slide, and I didn't grab the clicker. But really appreciate. That's it. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'll give Juan the floor in a second to introduce himself, but I think really at the core, sort of both of our organizations are really focused on sort of getting safe, sustainable, and resilient housing and buildings to communities. We work at sort of maybe very different ends of the spectrum, but ultimately, sort of working towards sort of providing those safe, affordable, sustainable, and resilient housing for everybody. So I'm at the International Code Council. We develop model building codes and standards and a lot of the tools that really support their activation. So thinking about education and training, looking at building materials, product testing, sort of all of those pieces. And Juan, if you could give us a little bit on sort of where BuildChange is and where do you work?
Yeah, hi. I'm Juan Caballero. I'm an architect from Honduras, and I work at BuildChange. We've been around for about 20 years, and we work in resilient housing, all types of housing, mostly in emerging economies and vulnerable populations. So we've done a lot of new housing, and lately have also gone into existing housing improvement. And one thing that is important here is that most of our clients, both in new construction and in home improvement, are clients of the informal sector. So people who have self-produced or self-built their housing, and in many cases, these are houses that are either non-compliant with construction codes, but also very vulnerable in face of natural disasters, be them climate-induced or not climate-induced. That segment is a huge part of the construction existing today, of the housing construction system today. Some of the countries where we work at have realized that, existing inadequate housing, which is known as the qualitative housing deficit, is now it's larger than the new housing deficit. So as there is a transition to better technologies of construction, that is actually a great opportunity. We have a huge part of the housing pie that is already built, that is not fit for purpose, that as climate change gets worse and hurricanes and typhoons and things like these happen more and more strongly, are going to be less fit for purpose as we go on. So improving on that is a great part of what we need to do. And I'll give it back to you, and then I'll keep going.
Yeah, no, I think it's certainly great to sort of get the lessons learned from where various different countries are sort of in that process. With the title of the session, sort of recognizing that communities and countries are at sort of various different places along the spectrum. And so one of the beauties of ICC is really being able to sort of collect best practices of regulatory systems and building industry ecosystems to really identify sort of what are those core elements to drive progress to achieve those safe and sustainable and resilient housing. And so this graphic really captures sort of many of those elements through that process and really supports the initiative that we've launched in support of the Buildings Breakthrough, really looking at building capacity for safe, sustainable, and resilient buildings with sort of codes, standards, technical assistance, education and training, sort of all of these pieces at the core, but really being able to identify, what are the resources that are specific, to the various different communities to really help sort of drive this progress forward. And so sort of capturing, everything from sort of what's happening in the informal structure to, sort of the most advanced systems in place, and really right-sizing it for, where jurisdictions are, where communities are. It really does not make sense for, sort of taking whole cloth of, global north developed standards and trying to move it into, communities, in the global south or elsewhere without that context and really understanding sort of where if you want to talk a little bit maybe about the project in Colombia, specifically on sort of the opportunities for moving from sort of that informal sector into a more sort of organized, code-based sort of regulatory system.
Yeah, no, I want to say this process is exactly the same. It's just a different, with different flavors. So I'll develop a little more on a specific case in Colombia. Maybe even hone it down to a specific case of Bogota. Bogota is a 1 million building city, and Colombia has, as you know, a pretty good construction code. Last version was put out in 2010, but that's basically a U.S. code tropicalized to Colombia. It's very much a code for new construction and buildings. That's getting improved. But out of that million buildings, about 800,000 are housing units. And out of that, about 75 to 80% are the houses I was just talking about. These are houses that are self-produced outside of the code. And in this case, they're highly exposed to earthquakes. There hasn't been a big earthquake in Bogota for about 100 years. Consolidation and land tenure improvements and all of this, and urban regeneration, which has largely started to happen in the country, has led to this housing going from very light temporary construction at the beginning, which was precarious housing, mostly driven by rapid urbanization because of the war in Colombia, being, as I said, it's gone from very temporary type construction to 2, 3, 4, 5-story unreinforced masonry, largely unreinforced masonry buildings, self-produced, very vulnerable. So fixing that is very difficult. The existing construction code does not translate at all to that problem. And the country does have a number of initiatives and resources to channel subsidies to improving this housing, but they couldn't do it. They couldn't. Nobody knew what to do with these houses. It's illogical, also from an environmental perspective, to think that you're going to demolish probably north of 600,000 existing houses and replace them with nice, green, and better built construction. So that's not going to happen anytime soon. So two things we were looking at. One thing we did that took us a lot of time was to kind of tropicalize a retrofit design procedure for being used in this types of buildings. So we've been able to develop and get approved and incorporated in the existing construction code in Colombia a methodology to evaluate and design structural retrofits for these types of buildings, 1, 2, and 3 stories, not more than 3 for now. The rest are going to have to have a different treatment. But that is a big step. I believe it's the first time that a design procedure, a simplified engineering design procedure, has been written into the code as a formal document. So it's now a national document incorporated to the construction code in Colombia. That, and that in this case, I think that's important. As we know, the code itself is not going to do anything unless there's people using it and actually getting it adopted. But at least that legal barrier and that procedural barrier has been overcome. It took all of this to get to that point in that one document, and involving mainly from local stakeholders, a lot of local stakeholders adoption. One other item I want to point out is why it does make sense also from an environmental standpoint. So we were talking here about embodied carbon. I also heard, where do the workers live? This is where the workers live. These are the houses where the workers live. It doesn't matter if your whatever factory is going to make it after the earthquake or after the hurricane if workers are not going to be able to come to work and their houses are going to be putting them at risk. And from a carbon standpoint, we just also looked back at about 300 houses, actual houses that we have helped retrofit, existing vulnerable housing that we have helped upgrade. And in terms of embodied carbon avoided, retrofitting these houses for resilience will extend their life or use cycle, but will also upcycle them and will avoid about 70% of embodied carbon versus rebuilding them or building them new. That is also an opportunity to do this with better technology. And this is just using the same exact technology, masonry as it is today. But if you incorporate lower carbon materials and better technology, that can even be higher.
Great, and I think that really gives a great example of the need for a holistic strategy to advance buildings, and particularly I think, as you mentioned, the sort of intersection of climate mitigation and climate adaptation together. So really appreciate that. Maybe you want to take a minute and talk about sort of the education piece of, sort of now that the guide is sort of accepted as practice, how do you actually get people to use it?
Well, that's a whole other effort. That is definitely a whole other effort. There's there's a lot of engineering and product testing, inspection, plan permitting, all this that went into getting that document done. That's step one. Then we had to work. We've been working with the government to kind of bring it even down to lower levels where they have a Category 3 retrofit is a fully engineered one, and then a Category 1 is a very basic one that is more incremental. All of this has gone, and it's not just us BuildChange, it's the government and other stakeholders like Swiss Contact and many other partners, the local engineering association. It also has to come with technical assistance for the people close to them, close to the neighborhoods, where builders or non-builders, the people who are actually producing the housing, can improve on their daily practices. Even the hardware shops where they sell cement and rebar and all of this are also very useful in transmitting that type of knowledge. The fact that in Bogotá in Colombia, they have actually money to allocate from public sources to improving this existing housing, because dignified housing is a right enacted in the Colombian Constitution, so the government has to mobilize some kind of funding for it. Makes it easier, because when you train a community, or when you train people in a community and there's actual work to be had by that training, then of course it makes a lot of sense, and that leads to better adoption.
Great. Well, definitely appreciate the context. I'll turn it back over to Matthew to wrap us up, I think.
I think you guys can just stay seated because I think we're going to get everyone back up. But thank you, Ryan and Juan. I think that was really nice to have a mini discussion. Hopefully now we're going to have a bigger discussion with everyone. But fascinating to hear some context there from Colombia and trying to put some of those practices into action. So for the last 20 minutes of today's session, we're going to have a bit of a Q&A. So if everyone who has spoken today would like to make their way to the front, and hopefully we have enough stools. Does anyone know if this is the biggest panel we've had in this room so far this week? Nice.
And then we
excellent. Okay. This is a bit weird because I feel like I'm slightly behind everyone, so I'm going to do this again. We're going to do a few questions. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, that's much better. All right, I've got a few questions about the topic that we've all just been feeding into to start with, and then hopefully we can go to our audience in a minute. But obviously we started with Marta taking us through the IHRB project, and we've got a few of the pieces of art in the room and some outside. So the first question, and anyone can go for this, I'm not going to go for everyone in a row because that might take a while, but do any of you have any thoughts on the role of visioning exercises such as this can have in terms of inspiring change, and any thoughts about the actual art presented and how that might influence change within the sector? Marta, I think you could start. I was going to say you don't have to start, but...
Yes, I could start. Well, of course, art is both about final result, but is also about the process. And when I think about the process, I think about the risks of not addressing the decarbonization in the built environment with a just transition. The decarbonization process in the built environment is taking place, but we know that it is being too slow. And it is being mainly because there's backlash from communities that are feeling excluded, that they are not feeling like they have a space to have a say or to participate and to decide. So having these spaces to create collective visions on what the just transition means gives us a space to feel all these communities included. I described the process in which we got the input to create those art pieces, and it included a really wide range of actors, so that they participated, they felt included, but also, of course, to as a process, but as a result, this serves us and this serves the people seeing the art pieces to feel more connected to very distant realities. So, yeah.
Excellent. Philippe, you had a comment?
No, I mean, visioning is not the kind of visioning we do here at COP. We talk big stories or big numbers, but really area-based, place-based, no? And it's involving, in a sense, translating what we are talking about into really settings of every day and involving people. And this is kind of also what we are doing in these. We feel that the kind of material transitions that we are imagining need to be graspable and need to be touchable and smellable, as it were. And it's important not just for residents or users, but also actually to demystify what is connected to these old materials that are socialized as being associated with poverty, backwardness. We need to have spaces where we show what is possible and how it can speak to contemporary cultural, social, economic challenges, and make it, create pilots, create settings where we can have this visioning.
I think one important thing to maybe add is, sort of as the building industry, we've created this sort of ecosystem around ourselves, but we haven't brought sort of the needs of people in many cases into that. And often, people don't have a way of sort of expressing in sort of our building speak what they need. But art can certainly, provide a pathway for us to be able to understand, what is that need at the local level. And so I think that's really sort of a valuable piece of the process that often isn't necessarily there.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice point, Ryan. I think not only in this session, we've heard it throughout the last week of content around the built environment, even in the Buildings Breakthrough launch about, putting people first, and again, trying to reconcile that this transition is not just about emissions reduction and decarbonization, whilst that is obviously extremely important, that we have to consider these other points as well, and whether it's visioning or realizing these problems and solutions in a different way in order to get that connection with communities can only be a good thing. Any other comments?
Yeah, I think the art is a great reminder that what we are all trying to do here is make our house safe and good to live in, right? Be that house our planet or the house we are living in. And art is a great way to remind us of that. And this is a great synthesis. I enjoyed very much looking at these.
Just a short comment. I think visioning is really important because all these discussions that we have here and also maybe in the trade union movement tends to be a little bit technical. And I think the most important thing from a worker's perspective is that transition is in workers' everyday life. The industrial sector is always in a transition, and we don't necessarily have so good experience from transition, So the visioning this time is if we are going to do a just green transition, we can do it in another way. And we have to convince and vision that the future for the workers. So then I think it could go much better this time.
I think with this one we can fix some of the things we didn't get right before also, right?
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that's been said, that Marta started out at the beginning of the session with a slide that talked about hearts and minds, winning hearts and minds or shifting hearts and minds. And I think that that is one of the most important things about art, is that it's the speed at which you can communicate and how much you can communicate very quickly. I mean, we can have all the technical, solutions that we want. We can have the reasons and the data and the bar charts and everything, but we're not going to move hearts and minds without culture and without art. And so, to me, that it should be art first, even.
I think that's a fantastic point, Anna. I was going to say a similar sort of thing from a personal perspective. I remember a few years ago I watched a documentary film on migrant workers at the recent World Cup in Qatar, and documentary film art, a way of humanizing and rationalizing all of these things that we tend to put in reports. And I know many people in this room are guilty of publishing several reports. But, as you said, it's a fantastic way for us to put these ideas out there and connect further with people beyond the industry, because, those are also the people that need to be reached. Wonderful. Okay, so we've started to touch on this, throughout the session. The theme of this session has been, not just the E, but also the S in ESG. So if we think about, if we had a pure focus on climate action risk that leaves some communities behind, but we're also trying to reach a consensus on equitable climate policies. If we go too far that way, do we risk delaying action? So with the same communities likely to be most affected. So how do we address this? How do we ensure that these topics are being integrated into the work that we do without necessarily delaying the quite urgent climate action that we need to see, within the next 5 to 6 years by 2030?
I mean, I can certainly start, and I think Juan hit on this as well. Is you can't have one without the other. If we're going to construct buildings today, those are buildings that are going to last 50 and 100 years. And if we don't do it right, we're going to lock in energy and efficiencies, but we're also going to lock in social vulnerabilities. And so you really need to have that holistic approach. We've done some analysis on sort of the benefits that our hazard resilience codes have provided. Because those buildings remain standing, they're not subject to wildfires or earthquakes or cyclone events. And because they've remained standing, we've saved carbon emissions because we don't need to reconstruct them. So it's got to be hand in hand.
Yeah, on that I completely agree with you. Again, on the backlash that can happen from communities with decarbonization actions, we should have everyone on board as much as we can in the implementation of decarbonization policies in the built environment, and you cannot have everyone on board if there is a huge portion of the population that feels that it's being overburdened with the weight of the changes, because there's going to be changes. So we need to have everyone on board, and you cannot have one without the other.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. No, I agree. You can't have one without the other here. And I think the question is complicated because it could be the other way around. If we make this in an inclusive process where all the stakeholders, communities, workers are included in the process, it might even get to a quicker transition. Because if we don't do that, you'll end up having people social vulnerable, and it might take even longer. So I think it's a precondition for this that we include all the stakeholders in it.
Precondition, I like that. I like that. If no other comments, then I've got a few more questions, but maybe we can start with some audience questions if anyone has any.
My question's, I think, directed at you a little bit. I think the transition that we saw in, say, Bhutan and to the biomaterial suppliers, we were at Anna and I were at a summit on biomaterials in Boston a couple weeks ago, and around codes and the regulations and the policies and the onus on manufacturers to kind of go through the rigmarole of that process. It's timely, and it's very it's timely and it's costly, right? And it's funny to see recently our Henning Larsen going and doing fire testing on a thatch thing, because they're basically, the biosuppliers are at such a scale. I think right now they're smaller. It's more cottage industry. It's not, it's how can we help the people and farmers and small scale producers get over codes and regulations that have been designed around industrial production. I think that kind of scale is a real critical thing that's not just relevant in the context of New England, but in, Honduras and Rwanda and other places where, not just the construction of housing is done by small builders, but the production of materials is also done by small producers. And that code piece in that cog was really great illustration. How do we lower the cost of getting that through to make it, to allow the supply of these materials to get to the market that much quicker and everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a challenge. And if we think about sort of the role of codes, I mean, they're there for a reason. There's a variety of sort of different performance attributes that we're trying to protect from, whether that's fire or structural and environmental. And so being able to sort of recognize all of those pieces sort of creates complexity in the process. Also, we have sort of the challenge of the building industry of being sort of so fragmented, so many sort of different materials and processes that can really sort of create challenges. I think one of the things that we've seen sort of as a challenge in sort of the new and emerging product space is sort of the disconnect between, and this is more towards the industrial side, but I think maybe a little bit applicable on the smaller production side, is sort of this disconnect between research and development and the regulatory side. So folks are sort of developing these new products in a bubble without even understanding sort of the code landscape in the jurisdictions where they're trying to produce or to provide those products. So I think having a more sort of holistic ecosystem and being able to engage sort of across that entire process. I think there's also maybe some opportunities, from the governmental level to provide that assistance and being able to look holistically on economic development opportunities, workforce development opportunities, trade opportunities, and see the value beyond just sort of the environmental benefit of a particular product, but seeing sort of the holistic opportunities. So I don't think it's an easy answer, but certainly one that we can definitely do a better job at.
To add to that, and I agree with that, ultimately it's also market. If people think it makes sense and they want to use it, they will. If you can have really great mandates, codes, products, but if people don't adopt them, either because they're too expensive or too difficult or too far away, or just they don't like them, it's not going to happen. So it's, it's about people and what they want, I guess.
But I mean, the discussions, I think, are very different in what's relevant in Central Europe, for instance, to what might be relevant for Tanzania or even South Africa. So in Germany, where I'm from, I see subsidies now being wasted on, keeping kind of dinosaur business models going, just because there was a little bit of a credit crunch and suddenly an affordability discussion for construction, and the big babies are crying. So I see subsidies urgently needed to create, to allow niche products, which, paludiculture products or clay earth, and it's all nice and it all looks good on the pictures, but it's niche. It's absolute niche product for enthusiasts, and we have a few years' time to get this into scaling, and this is where the subsidies should go.
That's right.
And when the EU is kind of withdrawing free certificates for cement and steel, apparently from 25, 26 onwards, there will be kind of level playing field, but then we have nothing to build with, and it's the next crisis coming. So, but in Cape Town, or let's say in a space which you brought in, unregulated, beyond code, where the majority of urban construction is going. I think that we can forget about codes. It's about jobs. It's about showing job opportunities. Mitigation, adaptation they're abstract arguments. It is, if it doesn't include job creation for locals, forget it. And I think there we have, actually something to offer. With these sort of regionally based kind of products that actually are not, cement and steel are organized, and the value goes and the profits go somewhere completely different. They give free cement use out in townships. People told us. So it's like a drug. It's a drug being pushed into these kind of contexts to create a demand. And this is where action needs to happen. Sorry, I've been talking too long.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that, but I also think that even though there are huge disparities between formal, semi-formal, and informal sectors, this is where global embodied energy codes have a role to play with country pledges, because at least with the public procurement process, if it's a substantial enough portion of building, it does at least give that opportunity for those local smaller producers from, let's say, forest and agriculture, et cetera, to be able to demonstrate. And it also, it at least, in a sense, provides an inverse penalty in a way to the producers that are high carbon, and thereby sort of inadvertently subsidizing the low carbon products at the public procurement process. So having those country pledges and at least leading by example, it gives a toehold into the marketplace for some of these producers.
I think it's a good segue into maybe what might be our final question. Maybe we can come to the audience once more, but you both kind of touched there on subsidies in relation to this. So maybe, you know, to the rest of the panel, what other types of incentives, you know, would you suggest or would be useful in terms of pushing either governments or private sector stakeholders to implement some of the solutions and things we've discussed today in terms of supporting that just transition, apart from subsidies, maybe, in the right places?
Well, I mean, you mentioned procurement. I mean, there's lots of different ways that procurement can drive change. I mean, I think certainly for government buildings themselves, but if we also think about social housing, there are opportunities to wrap in requirements as part of the procurement process. In that realm, I think certainly opportunities, as I mentioned, economic development and workforce development, which would not necessarily be sort of a direct procurement of those products, but really allow them to enter the marketplace with a strong basis for their use. So I think those are maybe a couple different ways.
And on the procurement processes, only to add, there is a really strong need of communication between the public government officials and also private businesses. We've seen many good examples, very ambitious examples of tenders that have incorporated strong social and environmental commitments, but once they get out in the market, there's no one applying for them. So we need to strengthen these dialogues between the ones writing the tenders and the ones who might apply for them.
Okay, I'm going to push it. Maybe we can have one more question. Yep.
On the procurement question, I'm surprised. What would be the size of the public procurement market in the countries you're working in? Is it 2%, 1% of what's built? What do you think it could leverage in truly? I mean, apart from being a massive subvention to some to some industry. That's one of the questions. Like, well, other question would be what be the no. Okay, let's in the interest of time, let's stay on this question, because I see so many people talking about public procurement as something that is going to magically change things. But I don't know, from France, from where I am. I mean, it's obviously there's lots of things going on, and we are innovating public buildings and things like that, but I don't see it as a market changer. What I see is regulation changing the market, is governments paving the way for the long term so that the industry can adapt and massively invest for a huge market, but not the market that the government is really owning. Oh, this is my point of view, and I would really like to know what you think about that. Because if you tell me that in some countries procurement is 50% of the market, then I say, okay, yes, this is a heavyweight. But from my experience, not the case. And the public and the public sector is poor also, as you might know.
I mean, in some countries, the public sector is a very substantial percentage of formal construction. But I'd actually like to use the example of France as an example, if you might, because I think it's a good example of where we're not necessarily we can talk about disproportionate impact. So, for example, in the Mitterrand administration in the 1990s had a percentage of all public works projects that was going towards research and development of new materials. And that budget, in some cases, if you're looking at large water filtration plants or other large, public works projects, you're talking about billions of dollars over the course of the year. So there were major innovations that happened out of that program that were about public-private, both partnerships for research and then deployment into large-scale projects. And even if they were a small percentage of the actual buildings that got built, they were leaders. They were quote-unquote trophy buildings. And the trophy buildings all across the world, if we look at the last 100 years, have set agendas for means and methods for buildings, and they've been very important examples. So it's not just about market share, it's about the example and the public demonstration of something happening. And this is a very important concept for sure, per what Philippe was talking about earlier about biomaterials and the lack of acceptance, for example, of biogenic materials in certain marketplaces where they might be associated with informal construction or indigenous, vernacular, older, poor building. We can see this as an example. I will use the example of Honduras with the new American embassy in Honduras, in Tegu, for example. Sorry, I can only pronounce half of that. That's a good example of showing on a quote-unquote trophy building a large-scale biomaterials facade that is linking materials that have certain associations with a prestigious building, and that can shift market, and that goes to the art piece, that goes to culture, to how much culture and these very high impact prestigious buildings are disproportionately impactful in pulling and pushing the marketplace for perception.
Showing the way by
lead by example.
Iconic buildings do shift the marketplace.
It's very different to lead by example. Very different to lead by example by buying 200,000 windows, and to lead by example, as you say, by building an iconic building that would show the way. I mean, this is very different. So,
but if we look at the history of architecture in the last 100 years, we can see that iconic buildings have shifted global marketplaces.
Exactly.
That's right.
This is for sure. I understand that.
It's a marketing strategy, totally. You know, it's most of the people we work with across the planet, they aspire to a cement-based concrete building because that's what's associated with prosperity, wealth, with safety. In many cases, that's actually true. A concrete building is resilient and safe in many cases. So, you know, it's about convincing people, and the way to convince people is to show them that it actually can happen. Yeah. You can talk to them about mass timber or something fancy, but if they don't actually see a house that made it through the hurricane, that made it through the earthquake, they have tangible proof of traditional, well, quote-unquote traditional, modern materials being competent. They need the same for others, right, for other alternatives. Or else they're just going to be nice things in magazines, as happens often.
Well, I think another sort of important piece is just the sort of the trades within the building industry are not just working on government projects. They may be on a government project today, but tomorrow they're on an office building or in their multi-family building. And so if we can prep them with sort of the latest technology or the latest practices that drive towards the decarbonization goals, for instance, that a government may have, they may translate that into the next project. And so you have sort of those snowball effects that sort of permeate throughout the entire industry because the government invested in a particular project.
I mean, I also hope that through Building Breakthrough or other initiatives, the funding flows from, which is also public funding, going through development assistance or transfer funds for loss and damage, you know, will somehow be really have robust kind of standards built into it. And I'm not talking about sort of fancy kind of iconic buildings in the sense of signatory architecture. But I would be completely happy with background buildings which are very modest, but which consistently and qualitatively invest in and support local supply chains and transitions towards other kind of material palettes. So I wonder if there could be a concerted effort to actually mobilize development assistance and transfer funds to actually really help anchor these projects or these new approaches in other countries.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I just definitely echo that. I mean, we've all talked about buildings as the places, or you hear this phrase a lot, where you work, live, play, etc. And I guess a lot of that is done in government buildings or public buildings. So I definitely echo that leading by example point. And any action is hopefully something that encourages further action down the line, sending the necessary demand signals that we want to see. I think we've got time for one more question from the audience. If anyone's got anything burning that they want answered, any final points from the panel? No? If not, then we'll wrap up. It's getting late into the afternoon, but one more final round of applause to our panel. Thank you so much for joining us and for helping us learn a little bit more today.
Oh yeah, I think it's just a little...
It's hard.
I don't have a lot of detail because I don't live in